Next up, everybody. Yeah.
After a person passes away, what level of knowledge do they have of the world around them? Are they totally omniscient? Are they totally ignorant? What do they know?
Well, the question is, after someone dies, what awareness or knowledge do they have of what's going on in the world here? So the Gemara in Brachas makes it very, very clear that they do know something. Now, it's not really clear exactly what they know. They clearly do not know every detail because it's not important to them. So it seems to be that they are attuned to the spiritually important developments of their children, of their family, of their loved ones. They're aware of their aliyos and their yeridos. They don't necessarily know if you bought a new car or whatever it would be. So we don't know, but the one thing is it's mukhrach from the Gemara in Brachas that there is some knowledge. And they are mishtatef in the tsar of their family, and they're mishtatef in the simchas of their family. I'll tell you two things. Number one, there is an old minhag that's brought down in Svarim that when you make a chasana, you go to the graves, the kvarim of your parents, if they're not alive, and you invite them to the chasana. And their neshamos are at the chasana itself, and they're Samayach with the chasana and the Kallah. Somebody asked me if you could do that for a bar mitzvah. I don't know. I guess you're allowed to do it for a bar mitzvah. I'm not sure if they respond to the invitation, but there is such a thing. Now, they tell the Maisa with the Mezerich Maggid, the Maggid of Mezerich, who was the Baal Shem Tov's successor as the head of Hasidim, that this was a time when life was very, very difficult for the Jews in Russia. And they asked the Maggid, when you go to Shemayim and you see the tsaras that we're going through, will you be a melitz yosher? Will you intercede? Will you pray to Hashem to take away the tsaras? And the Maggid promised to his Talmidim that he would do so. And when the Maggid died, the tsaras got worse and worse and worse, and it was never getting better. So the Maggid appeared to them in a dream, and they asked him, why aren't you keeping your promise? You promised that you would ask Hashem to take away all of the bad things that are happening to Klal Yisrael. So the Maggid said, I really, really, really intended to keep my promise. But from my vantage point, I don't see anything bad happening. Meaning his understanding of the world was such that he saw that even the difficulties and even the negatives were gamzu l'tova. That was a certain madrega that a person reaches when they're separated from the body. You see a gamzu l'tova, which in some ways is very comforting. I've heard victims of the Holocaust or survivors of the Holocaust who lost their parents, lost their children, lost their family. And they would often express it in this way. They say, after 120 years when I go to Shemayim, I will have many, many questions to ask the Ribbon Shalom. But it's interesting that in that statement, they were expressing an emunah that somehow they're going to get some answer, even though we can't imagine what that answer would be. So that's kind of the hakara of Gamzu L'Tova in ways that we have no perception of how that could even be possible. Yeah.
I was wondering if Reform rabbis, when they go to seminary, when they learn Gemara, or when they make hamotzi Shabbos night, or when they bow for the Amidah, even though the Amidah is changed, if they still get schar or some kind of reward for this.
Yeah, so Reform rabbis come in many, many different colors, and you actually cannot generalize about all Reform rabbis. There are Reform rabbis who actually, not that many today, but certainly when the Reform movement started, all Reform rabbis had been Orthodox. So these were people who were Orthodox, they had chinuch, they knew Torah, and they rebelled and they rejected it. That's one type. The modern Reform rabbi is a very, very different bird. The modern Reform rabbi becomes a Reform rabbi not because they are rebelling against Judaism, but because this is the Judaism they know, and they want to be as Jewish as they think they're able to be. So I wouldn't consider Gemara to be a major subject in the Reform seminary, although they do a little Talmud, but I would say it's well, I don't want to insult anybody, but I would say that a good a smart seventh grader is equal in Talmudic knowledge to a typical Reform rabbi, because what they do is, and I'm just talking about their curriculum. Their curriculum is focused on history, some philosophy, sociology, things like that. Gemara is not their big thing because they don't consider the Gemara to be binding in any way. It's like saying, what parts of Shulchan Aruch do they learn for smicha? I mean, it's just nothing in particular. Now, do they get rewards? So this is the interesting question. And we can ask that, you're asking it about a Reform rabbi. I could ask it about an atheist. Take somebody who does not believe all of the 13 principles of faith that the Rambam says is fundamental to go to Olam Haba. Now, atheists can do a lot of good. You can have an atheist who cures cancer. You have an atheist who gives charity. You have an atheist that feeds the hungry. And you can have Reform rabbis that are doing the same thing in many, many ways. So the question is, does Hashem reward you for the good deeds that you do when you don't have the requisite theological structure that legitimates them as mitzvahs? So this seems to be a big machlokus, actually. We don't have a definitive answer. If you look at the Rambam is very, very makbid on the notion that you have to have the theologically correct ideas. If you don't believe in God, if you don't believe the Torah came from Hashem, if you don't believe that the Torah is unchangeable, then even if you do a gazillion good deeds, you can't go to Olam Haba because you don't have the admission ticket. The admission ticket to Olam Haba is that you can affirm the 13 principles of faith. So based on the Rambam's understanding, at least the way many understand the Rambam, it would appear that people who fall under the category of kofrim or apikorsim do not get reward for their mitzvahs in the world to come. Now, the obvious question you'll ask me is, so how do they get rewarded? Does God simply ignore the good that they've done? The answer is they'll get something in Olam Hazeh. They'll get vacations, they'll get extra money. That'll be the schachar of Olam Hazeh. Now, in the Rambam's formulation, at least the way Rav Chaim Vittal understood it, there is no difference between those who don't believe in these things because they rebel, or those who literally never learned it. Even the so-called Tinok Shenishba, according to Rav Chaim's understanding of the Rambam, does not get a free pass, which is a very onerous standard, really. And from our perspective, it almost smacks as being unfair. But the point is, as Rav Chaim said it, an apikaris is nebuch an apikaris. You're an apikaris, and I feel sorry for you, but you're still an apikaris. What can I do about it? Now, other commentaries do have a different approach. Both the Yad Ramah, who's a Rishon, the Tiferes Yisrael, who's an Achron, makes the point that it is impossible that God does not reward a person for the good that they've done, even if they were atheists, even if they didn't believe in God, even if they were deficient in the 13 principles of faith. So according to the Tiferes Yisrael, the good that a person does will always have a reward, whether he's Orthodox, conservative, Reform, atheist, or whatever it is. There will be a form of Olam Haba, particularly when the person has an excuse that they weren't exposed to anything better. So this is a huge machlokas about the importance of what you might call theologically important beliefs as a necessary condition for Olam Haba. Now, I would differentiate between perhaps mitzvos bein adam lechaveiro and mitzvos bein adam lemakom. If an atheist who doesn't believe in God puts on tefillin because he's at his nephew's bar mitzvah, I don't think he'll get reward for putting on tefillin, because putting on tefillin has no value if you're not serving God. On the other hand, an atheist who gives charity and helps people, I think will get reward, because that is something that's intrinsically good, even if it's not part of the worship of God. So I would say that at least a kofer, which is not necessarily a Reform rabbi, would get schachar for bein adam lechavero, but wouldn't automatically get schachar for bein adam lemakom. Now, in the case of a Reform rabbi, I might go even further. If he truly believes in God, even if his conception is defective, he might get reward even for that, but not according to the Rambam. That's all. The Rambam would not go that direction, but if you go with the Tiferes Yisrael and the Yad Ramah, there would be a makam for that type of schar. So it's difficult. As I say, most Reform rabbis today are actually tinok shenishba. They're considered to be babies who were raised without a proper Torah environment, meaning they are they're a little more knowledgeable, but essentially they're in the same boat as their congregants. We can't look at them as Rishayim, we can't look at them as evil people, and there's a mitzvah to try to be makar of them and a mitzvah to connect to them in various ways, but whether that would translate into Olam Haba is a separate question. That's a big, big machlokas. Yeah.
How much does a person retain their individuality after death?
Yeah, that's a very, very excellent question. The issue becomes all of our souls are ultimately united in God. Our souls are the breath of God. In a sense, vis-a-vis Hashem, there is no individuality at all. The question is, when we die, do we retain our personality, our individuality, our autonomy? It seems from every description we have of Olam Haba, we are very much individual, meaning Olam Haba is not described as it might be in Buddhism or some other Eastern religions as this kind of obliteration of the self. There seems to be a very powerful awareness of who you are, what you've accomplished, what is your unique relationship with God. At the same time, there is also a unity and a togetherness and a union that takes place, but it seems that there very much is a consciousness of individuality. And in fact, this is why we describe you will be together with your loved ones. If you think about it, if you go with the model of obliteration and absorption in the totality of God, at that point, I would not even be aware of who is my mother, who is my father, who are my grandparents, etc. The very idea that there is this notion of reconnecting to all of the loved ones in your life, whether you've known them or not, seems to presuppose a model of individuality. So I think it's interesting that although one could make a very logical case in terms of pure, what you might call metaphysical logic, that why should there be a self when there's no body, but nevertheless, Judaism seems to recognize the notion of autonomy. Now, there is a counter thought, it's not a contradiction, but a counter thought from the Baal Tanya. The Baal Tanya basically says in Tanya, how can a person fulfill the mitzvah of loving another person as they love themselves? How can I love you as much as I love me? It's not possible. So the Baal Tanya says that that's only when you focus on the body, because on the level of the body, we are different people. There's me and there's you, so there's no way I can love you like I love myself. But when I focus on spiritual essence, since we all come from the same root and we're all rooted in the infinity of God, at that point, you and I are the same. We are the same. We are literally one. Therefore, the Baal Tanya says, the more one focuses on spirituality, the more one comes to recognize the universal and the essential unity of all of at least Bnei Yisrael, which kind of moves in the opposite direction of the obliteration of the self. So apparently both ideas are going on at the same time. But it's an interesting question. Yeah?
What is the connection between a person and the person they're named after?
Yeah, the connection between the person and the person they're named after, right? The Ashkenazic tradition, at least, is that we name people after people who are no longer alive. Sephardim don't have this. Sephardim are willing to name people. In fact, a father could name his son after him if he wanted to. But Ashkenazim, you got to be dead to have your name memorialized. And what the connection is, there are two ways of looking at it. On a superficial level, this is simply a matter of respect and honoring a parent or a grandparent or whatever. Kabbalistically, however, there is a deeper idea that there's kind of a union of a soul in which sparks of the soul of the niftar kind of are connected to the soul of the baby at the bris or whatever the baby is named, and therefore there is literally a binding of sparks of the neshama. Now that is why you will find that sometimes people will be reluctant to name a child after someone that was not religious, or name a child after someone who died young, or name a child after someone that had bad midos, precisely because there's that spiritual connection, which in theory might be a detrimental connection. Now, in order to have the spiritual connection, though, there's a lot of requirements, meaning this is not an automatic thing. The name has to be exact. So, for example, you can't name a person after two relatives. Let's say you call somebody Chaim Meir. Chaim is after my wife's father, and Meir is after my father. That's not going to work, because once you've used, in other words, you can use two names to memorialize. Yeah, you could say this is in honor of this grandparent and honor of that grandparent. But in order to have the spiritual connection, you can't have any name that is different in any way from the name of the nifter. It's also the case that you can't do a man-woman thing. Sometimes people will take a man's name and feminize it, like, Gavriel could be Gavriela, Raphael, Raphaela, Daniel, Daniela. But that can work on the level of memorial, but that cannot work on the level of spiritual connection. So Kabbalistically, though, if there is an exact correspondence, there's a connection. Now, what's interesting is, in terms of the issue of the non-religious relative, though, sometimes they give a certain eitzah. You can either add a middle name, in which case you don't have that problem, or you can even have kavana. Let's assume that you're naming a child and it's in memory of your grandfather Avraham, who happened not to be a Shomer Shabbos. So it says, you can say, this is in honor of my grandfather, but in your mind you're thinking, I'm naming the child after Avraham Avinu. So that way, you're not intending to connect on that particular level. And that doesn't have to be said. I mean, it would be a little insulting to say it, but that could be a hidden kavana in terms of the naming that would avoid that particular problem. Okay. Yeah.
Regarding the judgment on Rosh Hashanah, if a person dies during the year, does that mean they were marked down in the book of Rishaim? Or if a person lives through the year, does that mean they were marked down in the book of Tzadikim? Can a person who was judged as a Tzadik die that year? If so, what is the point of having two books of Tzadikim and Risham?
Yeah. So the question becomes, we say on Rosh Hashanah, God opens up the books of the Tzadikim, the Rishaim, the Beinonim, middle of the roaders. If you are a Rasha, it is written on Rosh Hashanah that you will die in the course of the year. If you are a Tzadik, it will be written that you will live in the course of the year. If you are a Beinoni, middle of the road, and most of us are actually considered Beinonim, so then what happens is a preliminary decision, which is called writing, is made on Rosh Hashanah, and it's not sealed until Yom Kippur. Okay, so the question becomes, no matter how righteous you are, there will be a year in which you're going to die. I mean, Chaim Vittal died, whatever it was, 2 or 3 years ago. So the question is, if somebody dies in the middle of the year, does that mean on Rosh Hashanah they were inscribed in the book of the wicked? How could that be? Because if the person was a tzaddik, then he couldn't have died that year because he was a tzaddik. But then there'd be no year that he could die, right? So how do you understand that? So here's the very interesting point. It's a very good, very, very good question, and the Achronim even the Rishonim go to great trouble to try to figure this out. But I'll share with you the thought of Maharal. Maharal, I think, just gives us the most sensible idea. And that is, every soul comes into the earth with a predetermined lifespan. You are born to live X number of years. So let's take an example. A person is born to live for 65 years. When we say, if you are a tzaddik, you are inscribed in the book of life, that doesn't mean you'll necessarily live the whole year. It just means you have been found worthy of living out your allotted years. If a person is a Rasha, that would be a decision. He's not worthy of living out his allotted years. So as a result, when two people die in the middle of the year, there are two different possibilities. Possibility one is the person was deemed to be a Rasha, and therefore he was inscribed in the book of death, or middle of the road and didn't merit to do tshuva on Yom Kippur. I'll call that the same possibility. The other possibility is he actually was a tzaddik, and he was inscribed in the book of life, but it happens to be that the allotment that he was given when he was born was 65 years, and this is his 65 years, you see? So therefore, you cannot infer from anybody who dies in the middle of the year that they were adjudicated to be a Rasha, maybe lehepech. Not only could it be that they were zocha to be mamale shanim, but it may very well be that maybe Hashem even extended his life because of his merits. That could be as well. Okay, so that's how the Maharal understands it, which makes a lot of sense, because otherwise you're going to have the dilemma: how could any righteous person ever die, since you got to be judged as a Rasha in order to be inscribed in the book of death? So this is the Maharal's Isha for that. Yeah.
What does it mean for Borchu when in Hashanah 20 of Gedolim, the Chaim Vittal writes that when a Tzadik gets close to a Rasha, the positive nitzitzot of the Rasha transfer to the Tzadik, and the less positive nitzitzot of the Tzadik transfer to the Rasha because of their connection. How does that fit into the modern movement? Is that essentially?
I didn't hear everything. You're saying that when the tzaddik is in proximity to a Rasha, there's like an energy exchange, you think?
It says in Hashanah 20 that the tzaddik should pursue the Rasha because there might be some nitzitzot of the tzaddik in the Rasha. When they get close, the positive nitzitzot transfer to the tzaddik from the Rasha, and the Rasha might essentially get the
Yeah. So the truth of the matter is, at least on a more cosmic level, this is actually a very, very fundamental idea in the Ari's Kabbalah. R Chaim Vittal, of course, is writing everything as the teachings of the Ari, in which in this world there are shattered sparks of holiness, and the tzaddik's goal is to gather up the scattered sparks of holiness, to return them to their source and revive them and sanctify them and elevate them. But these sparks of holiness are in all sorts of places. They're trapped. They're not used. Now, certainly Rav Chaim Vittal does not mean to suggest at all that if a Rasha has genuine goodness and genuine mitzvos, they're going to be stolen from him. That would not be fair. What? I mean, the guy did something good. He's referring to a much more subtle and metaphysical process in which there is hidden reserves of goodness that the Rasha is just imprisoning, that he's not using, he's not bringing out. It's mamish imprisoned. And there we say that tzaddik has a koach to liberate those sparks and elevate them. So one should not at all understand this as a process of cheating somebody of what they rightfully earned. It's the other way. This is pidyon shvuyin. This is redeeming the captives. And in Hasidic stories, you have all sorts of stories about even music that way. I'm sure you've heard the different stories of the Rebbe that hears this Hungarian shepherd singing a love song, almost an obscene, pornographic, song about love with a woman, and it's a beautiful nigun, a beautiful tune, and the Rebbe says, "Sing it again, sing it again, sing it again." So the Rebbe learned it, and then the shepherd forgot it all because this was a holy tune that had been misappropriated for evil purposes. And the Rebbe is now liberating it. This is actually the story of Boaz and Rus, where Rus, in the hated nation of Moab, had sparks of holiness coming down from Lot and Avraham. And Boaz saw in this Moabite woman sparks of holiness that he was going to liberate and free. So the notion of what is called nitzotza, shviras hakelim, the broken vessels, and the gathering of the sparks, is a fundamental idea in Lurianic Kabbalah, and Rav Chaim Vittal is applying it even to the single encounters of a Rasha and a tzaddik. But again, the only point I want to make is this is not a robbery. This is a liberation. This is a freeing. If the Rasha would be drawing on those kochos in any positive way, the Rasha would certainly get credit for what he's doing. Hashem does not withhold the reward, even from a Rasha, for the mitzvos that a Rasha does. Yeah.
There's some statues.
I didn't hear. Second.
There's some statues.
Yeah.
Of the Korban Atana and the Maharal. Would it be permitted for Jews to make them? Yeah, because it's like idolatry.
Yeah, statues of Maharal. Yeah, if you go to Prague, actually, I was never in Prague, but there's a bridge. And the Maharal was greatly, greatly venerated in Prague, even by the Catholics and the like, kind of like almost like a semi-god. So you're asking, are you allowed to have a statue of the Maharal?
Yeah, was it permissible for Jews to make it, or?
Yeah. So here we have a general problem with human images. Now, it's not avodah zarah. If you're not bowing, if you're not worshiping it like a god, it's not avodah zarah. But there actually is a general other halacha that's connected to avodah zarah, but it's separate, that you're not supposed to own human images. That there are certain things, unless they're imperfect in some way. So if you mutilate the nose or whatever it would be. So lemaisa, if you're asking me lechatchila, should I own a three-dimensional full body image of a human being? The answer is lechatchila, you certainly shouldn't own it. If it's only the head, there may be a makom to be mekel, and b'diavad, even a full body image, may be permitted if it's known that these are not used as objects of idolatry. So it's a very complicated sugya, owning these images. But lemaisa, lechatchila, surely you should not. You should not even own them, at least a full body image, because many Rishonim pashkin that it is usher. The Chafetz Chaim was married twice, and he had a child in his old age from his second wife. His last surviving child, who only was nifter a few years ago, was Rebbetzin Zaks. She had married a Reb Zaks. And she used to recount what it was like living as the daughter of the Chafetz Chaim when he was much older. And I'm going to digress a little bit, but there'll be a point connected to your question. So she says, he was a very, very loving father, and he didn't have rules. He didn't care if you sat in his chair. He was not makbid on kavod at all. You could do what you want, etc. But the one thing he was very makbid, as you would imagine, on lashon hara and on telling the truth. So she would tell the story that when the Mishnah Brewers came from the printers, and in a printed book, sometimes pages are missing or pages didn't print, so you have to flip through it. So he asked her if she could she didn't have to read it, just flip through these sets of Mishnah Brewers, 6-volume sets, to see if there's any missing pages. I don't want to sell anything that's missing pages. So she was going out to play, and the Chafetz Chaim asked her to do 10 sets. That would have been 60 volumes. It would have taken, 20 minutes or so. And she said, I got to go now. She's talking to Chafetz Chaim. I got to go now. When I come home, I can do 100 sets. I just can't do it now. So she runs out. She goes out and plays for a few hours. She comes back. There are 600 volumes of Mishnah Brura. That's 100 sets there. So she starts saying, Abba, you only asked me to do 10 sets, and now you're giving me 10 times? He says, well, you said you could do 100 sets. A person has to know whatever they say, they have to live up to. So sometimes she said it was too much of a pressure having such a tzaddik as a father. So she used to go to the town cemetery to relax because Chafetz Chaim was a Kohen. He was not allowed to go to the cemetery. A Bas Kohen could go to the cemetery. That way, she got away from the Chafetz Chaim. Anyway, I'm bringing up this little story because she told the story that one time she got a doll from an aunt in America who sent her a doll. And when the Chafetz Chaim saw the doll, he said, I have to give me the doll for a few minutes. And when he gave her back the doll was missing a nose. The nose was cut off. So she said, Abba, you cut off the nose of my doll. Chafetz Chaim said, it's an idol. And so the Chafetz Chaim was machmer on that. L'maaseh, Rav Avadya, so it's not so easy having a father that's a tzaddik kador. There are challenges there. Although again, she does say that when it came to anything about his kavod, he was totally low key about any of that. But Rav Avadya has a tshuva that we are mekel on dolls, but a doll and a statue actually might be different. So even if you're mekel on dolls, that's lav dafka, a full body statue. So I would say better not to have it. Okay, yeah.
Would that extend to going to an art gallery to look at statues?
No. So that's very good. Again, the halachos are don't make it and don't own it. Those are the halachas. You are allowed to view it unless it's an actual object of idolatry. So you're not allowed to look at objects that are mamash worshipped. But a statue of Maharal, for example, which is not worshipped, the only chumrah we would have is maybe not to own it or not to make it, if you would make it, if you're a sculptor, but there would be no isser to look at it and admire it. Okay, so you do have to differentiate between making, owning, and just looking at. Yeah.
Because of the machlokas with the Rasha and Rasha for Netilas Yadayim in the morning as to why Chazal were misaking it, if somebody knew that they weren't going to daven schacaris that day, would they still make the bracha on the Netilas Yadayim in the morning?
Yeah. Interesting question. The question is that in the Rishonim we find two different reasons for why we wash our hands, and in particular why we make the bracha on Netilas Yadayim. Is it simply because we're a bria chadasha, we're a new creation, and therefore it's a way of expressing the notion that God has renewed our lives? Or is it because our hands may have touched different parts of our body, and it's not proper to daven in a state of that type of uncleanliness? So the bracha of Al Netilas Yadayim is a hachana, a preparation for the mitzvah of prayer, a mitzvah of tefillah. So the question becomes, so we make a bracha for one of those two reasons. But what if I know for sure I am not going to daven? So as a result, according to the Rasha's reason, this would be a bracha levatala, a blessing in vain. So should I apply the rule to myself that if you're in doubt whether you are allowed to make a bracha, you shouldn't make a bracha? It's a very, very good question. Now, let me just clarify it a little bit. Do you mean he's not going to daven because he just isn't going to daven, he's not from enough to daven, or he has a problem with his body, or like is he?
No, like he doesn't. He's not up to a place in his Yiddish where he daven schacaris, and he puts on tefillin like in the afternoon. So
Yeah.
maybe he'll daven mincha or Maharal, but in regards to schacaris,
Okay.
that's not great.
So, I mean, I can give you an eitzah, but the eitzah, would probably be too complicated for somebody who doesn't want to daven schacaris. I mean, the eitzah would be that he could make the bracha on the Netilas Yadayim and then be shomer his yadayim until mincha time, meaning that Netilas Yadayim could cover mincha, lav dafka schacaris. But again, I'm not sure if a person on that madrega is going to be willing to, be conscious about where he puts his hands and the like. By the way, the Chafetz Chaim writes that if a person is truly shomer his yadayim, he could be somech on Netilas Yadayim of schacaris to even cover eating bread later in the day. Ad kedei kach. In other words, if I wash my hands 7 o'clock in the morning, and I am consciously shomer my yadayim from not touching areas of my body, I could be somech on that Netilas Yadayim to eat bread 11 o'clock, later and the like. But that requires a lot of consciousness. But the Chafetz Chaim on occasion did that when there was no water, when he was stranded in a place. He was actually somech on the notion that he was shomer yadayim. So in terms of the specific question, what I would tell the guy is that even if he's not up to davening a whole schacaris, he should say at least, let's say, morning brachas, very, very short. And that would be enough to allow him to make the bracha of Al Netilas Yadayim. If he's not going to daven anything at all, then ein achinami. I think a good svara could be he would not make the bracha. But I would tell him, say Birchas HaShachar, and then he'd be able to make the bracha for sure. Yeah.
To a follow-up question to his question asked a few minutes ago, in regards to the Tzadikim and the Rasha being the judgments on Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah.
So, according to Maharal's explanation, so where will somebody who's God forbid killed during the year, where does he fall into that category?
So this is really another question, and that is, the other question is, can the din of Rosh Hashanah be nishtana? Meaning, let's assume a person was a Tzadik, and he was inscribed in the book of life. And as a minimum, even if he might die in the year because he finished his allotment, but is it possible that somebody could kill him and terminate that. So that gets us part of a much, much larger question, which we've discussed many times in different contexts, and that is the power of a Baal Bechira to override a divine decree. If you remember, many people quote an R Chaim that says that because I have Bechira to do evil, I could kill a person even if God decreed that that person shouldn't die, because God also created a world where I have Bechira, and my Bechira can have fallout. So now, the Chovos HaLevavos seems to absolutely reject that contention, and many people find the R Chaim so astounding that they say it must be a forgery. That's R Chaim couldn't have written it, whatever it is. But all I'm saying is the particular nuance in your question would exactly be that issue of the koach of the Baal Bechira to kind of override a decree of Hashem. Yeah.
Igeres HaRamban starts off by saying we should speak gently in our ways.
Yeah.
Give me recommendations on how to practice that and bring that into ourselves.
Yeah. Your question reminds me a little bit. I was a Talmud of Ner Yisrael, so the principal of the high school, who was my principal of my high school, was Rav Yosef Tendler, Zichrono Livracha, a wonderful, wonderful person. There's also an art school biography, but he was quite a tough person. He was really a toughie, although a heart of gold. But we were scared to death of him for all the time. But he was once speaking to Mechanchim, and I think his own son-in-law asked him, how do we show our Talmidim that we love them? So he said, by loving them. I mean, you don't have to show anybody something. You got to be a certain type of person. Mele, it's going to happen that you show them love because you love them. So it's kind of the same answer. First of all, a little bit of word just to be sure everybody knows what you're talking about. I hope in the course of your yeshiva experience you have come across and hopefully read the very beautiful and very short, pretty short, Igeres HaRamban. Many Sidurim do have it at the end. I'm not sure if the Art Scroll has it in the Siddur or not. Igeres HaRamban was a letter the Ramban wrote to his children, to his son, when he left Spain to go to Eretz Yisrael. The Ramban spent most of his life in Spain, but his last years he came to Eretz Yisrael. That is where he wrote his Perush on the Torah and the like. And, in those days, Eretz Yisrael was not like a 12-hour Elal trip back and forth. You went to Eretz Yisrael, you weren't gonna go back. You were kind of there, and you might never see your family again. I'm not sure if he did see his children again. And he wrote them a farewell letter in terms of the values that he wanted them to have. And it's a very, very beautiful letter. He talks about humility. He talks about everybody you meet. You should try to identify a way that they're better than you. Kind of try to look at the good in people. And he begins, as you say, with the notion of speaking in a low voice, not yelling and the like. But I do want to point out that the Ramban is not necessarily supposed to be understood in a literal way. I mean, really, he's referring to a midah that you cultivate, a midah of humility, a midah of respect for people, a midah of not putting people down. He didn't mean badafka. If it happens to be that your voice is a little louder, the avodah is not train your voice. That's not the issue. This is not a manual about training your voice. It's a manual about training your midos. So I would recommend that the way you fulfill the first thing the Ramban says is by focusing on the next things the Ramban said, of looking at people in a good way, seeing their milas, understanding that, he makes the point that even if you can learn better and you're frummer, but ask yourself or think about what their family condition was, what their history was, and recognize that if you would have had their challenges, perhaps you would not have come out as good as them. And that's, by the way, is an interesting way of dealing with difficult people generally, right? All of us encounter difficult people. Of course, sometimes we are the difficult people, okay? Whatever it would be. And one of the ways we can deal with difficult people is, there's a saying in social work, hurt people hurt. That means people who have been hurt, they tend to hurt other people. So I look at somebody that's rough and rude and mean, But then I think to myself, I don't always know the story, but that's the whole point. I don't know what's happened in this guy's life. And maybe if I would have understood what's going on in his life, I would understand that that's why he is that way. And maybe I would have been worse, maybe. Maybe he turned out pretty good compared to everything he's been through. So that's what the Ramban is talking about, and therefore that's how you reach that particular level. Yeah.
How does Birchas Cohanim work?
How did what?
How does Birchas
Birchas
Cohanim?
Cohanim, yeah.
Is it like a force field? I mean, what's the starting point?
Yeah, Birchas Cohanim, right? So that what we just read about it 2 weeks ago, and Baruch Hashem, one of the most noticeable chidushim you have when you come to Eretz Yisrael is the recitation. You know, by now I'm used to it, but it was something that strikes people. Ashkenazim, of course, Sephardim say Birchas Cohanim every day, even in Chutz La'aretz, but Ashkenazim only do it on Yom Tov, except in Eretz Yisrael, or at least Yerushalayim, and the like. And the Torah describes, literally, that the Kohanim are a conduit, almost like an electric circuit, that there is divine energy that comes from heaven into the Kohanim, out of their fingers. It's almost like a magical thing. And it creates a shefa of bracha and hatzlacha. That is why, the same way there's a mitzvah on Kohanim to give the bracha, there's a mitzvah on Yisraelim to come and receive the bracha. When you come and the Kohen blesses you, you are makayim a mitzvah. Now, the Gemara does say, if you're not able to come to shul, or whatever it is, you can still benefit from the Kohen's bracha even though you're not there. But if you're able and you don't come, you're not nichlal in the bracha because you're rejecting the bracha by not coming to participate in it. I've mentioned a number of times before that the Ashkenazic minhag, that we only recite Birchas Cohanim on the musaf of a Yom Tov, is a very shver minhag. Why is there such a minhag? I mean, there's a mitzvah to duchen every day. The Torah does not say it's connected to Yom Tov. And yet, this is the old Ashkenazic minhag. The Ramah gives a defense, which is a shvach defense. The Ramah's defense is that only a Kohen that is in simcha can give a bracha. That bracha requires simcha. In Chutz La'aretz, everybody's grouchy, except on Yom Tov. There's no simcha even on Shabbos because we're thinking about Parnasa. On Yom Tov, we're finally relaxed, we're finally happy. Therefore, the Kohen gives his bracha. The Gra says, very, 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 very shver. I mean, what type of thing is that? I mean, some people are grouchy even on Yom Tov, and some people are happy even during the week. I mean, you're not going to make a subjective determination of who's besimcha, who's not besimcha. So because of this, the Gra himself was chaylik on the Ramah, and the Gra held it was proper to do Birchas Cohanim every single day, even in Chutz La'aretz like Sephardim. But it's brought down that every time the Gra tried to establish this minhag, the shul burnt down or something. Min hashamayim, there were ikuvim, and the Gra understood that the Eibishter does not want the Golah, at least Ashkenazim in the Golah, to have duchening every day. But this explains how it became the Ashkenazic minhag in Eretz Yisrael, because the Ashkenazic yishuv of Yerushalayim was essentially started by the Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon. So when they came to Eretz Yisrael, most of the Jews here were Sephardim, and they already were doing it. So that gave them an excuse to follow their Rebbe's psak, and that's how duchening got introduced. That's why in the Galil, if you go up to Tzfat and Tiberia, you will actually find that the minhag is not to duchen every day. And the reason is because the nucleus of the Ashkenazic yishuv of Yerushalayim are the Talmidei Hagra, but the Yesod, the nucleus of the Yishuv Ashkenazi in the Galil are the Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov. And they accepted the Ramah, they did not have the Hachra of the Gra, and as a result, it's a little strange because the official minhag of Tzfat is they duchen every Shabbos at Mincha. Now it's hard to know where that comes from, because the minhag of the Geilah was only on Yom Tov, and the minhag of the Sephardim was every day. So where do you get a duchening only on Shabbos at Musaf, it seems to be kind of a compromised position, but I just want to point out that the reason why Yerushalayim and the Galil are different is because one is from the Gra and the other is from the Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov. Now, obviously, today everything is sumished. Yerushalayim is full of Hasidim, and Tzfat has, Litvaks as well. So we're all mixed up together, but still, the minhagim that remained were the original minhagim that had been established. Yeah?
How does one know if they're a good person?
How do they know? How do you know if you're a good person? Very, very good question. Now, one answer might be, who says you got to know? Meaning, God judges me. I don't have to judge people shouldn't judge me, and I shouldn't even be judging myself. I should focus, you see, and I'm not putting you down because the very thing you're going through, all of us go through. So there's nothing, strange with that question. But if we were to simply address it in the abstract, it's kind of an egotistical idea to say, oh, how am I doing today? Am I doing good? Am I doing bad? Well, is life about me, or is life about the glory of Hashem? So one response might be, I don't think about myself. I don't think about myself poorly. Yeah, that's important. And I don't think about myself grandiosely. Rebbe Akiva Eger once said, the definition of a modest person is not that he thinks of himself poorly. That's not good. It's that he's not really thinking about himself. He's focused on the job, the task. So in the abstract, that's the answer I would give. But I do understand realistically that, all of us have a certain amount of self-preoccupation. In fact, this was the Chazon Ish's taina on the Musar movement a little bit. The Chazon Ish was well known that he did not fully endorse the Musar movement. Now you might say, what's wrong with Musar? I mean, work on midos. What, he's against midos? He's against good midos? Of course he wasn't against good midos. But Musar involves a lot of thinking about yourself. And the Chazon Ish actually felt that thinking about yourself, even for cheshbon and nefesh, can become a little obsessive and depressing and compulsive. And therefore, the Chazon Ish actually said, don't think so much about yourself. Every time you daven mincha, you ask yourself, did I do good mincha or bad mincha? He says, do the mitzvahs, right? So that's one approach, meaning be a person who's focused on the job and not on what it says about me. The other way of looking at it, though, is, you ask yourself, honestly, you have to be honest. You have to say, what is it that I need to improve in? What can I be better in? Am I doing the best that I can, given my energy, given my limitations? And you have to believe, although sometimes it's hard for us to take that message, that Hashem is a God of mercy and a God of love. And if you're doing the best that you can, you are okay in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because he's not expecting more of you than that. He is expecting that, to be sure, but he's not expecting more than that. And therefore, one should not be overly nervous. If you're doing what you're able to be doing, you're doing the right thing. Okay, and you need to, different people are nervous in different ways, but if you have a bit of a nervous temperament, you need to reassure yourself of that. Hashem is not out to get you. I remember when I was in college, I took a course in, American literature. So one of the excerpts was from a Puritan preacher. I think his name was Jonathan Edwards. He was a very, very famous, this is before there was the United States, a very famous Puritan preacher. And the excerpt there was a sermon that he gave, and it was called Sinners in the Hands of a Wrathful God. Talk about Musar. The old Puritans, can't beat them. So he said, you are in the eyes of, maybe I shouldn't even tell you this, I don't want to give you bad thoughts, but I want to give you an example of how not to give Musar. He says, you are like an ugly, repulsive insect that God is holding between his fingers in front of a fire. You disgust him. He wants to crush you, throw you into the fire. That's who you are. Now, unfortunately, in the course of our yeshiva training, that is sometimes a message that we might be absorbing. And that's too bad. That's really too bad, because that's not the way it is. Hashem is not a gotcha person. He's not like, some people perceive that Hashem creates these obstacle courses. And he's waiting for you to fail. You're doing this, that. Gotcha. It's not a gotcha game. He just wants you to do the best that you can. And if you do the best that you can, you're doing good. Okay, and you gotta tell yourself that. Yeah.
So I mentioned an idea that one can rely on washing his hands in the morning to eat bread in the afternoon.
Very b'diavad, very b'diavad,
Does
yeah.
that mean one shouldn't speak all morning as well?
So, this is a little complicated. Me'ikar hadin, and this is only b'shas hatchak. Even though you normally do not talk between Netilat Yadayim and Hamotzi, right? Everyone knows you don't talk. But me'ikar hadin, if you were shomer your Yadayim and you weren't mesiach das. See, the problem with talking is that you're not focusing on your hands. But theoretically, if you consciously were shomer Yadayim, even the talking would not stop you. So the Chavetz Chaim would have been allowed to do what he did, b'shas hatchak, even if he actually talked. But as I say, this is b'shas hatchak, and we normally don't rely on this. But again, this is talking about a case where there was literally no water. Of course, again, I don't know why the Chavetz Chaim, I have to go back to the story. I don't know why there aren't other eitzes. I mean, you could put a napkin on your hand. I mean, there are other eitzes for people who don't have water for netilat yadayim. But the Chavetz Chaim held that he was shomer his yadayim. He didn't even have to have a napkin on his hand. Ad kedei kach. Yeah.
In this past week, for Bahalocha, I'm not too well versed in Navis, maybe I will clarify, but I think it was Zachariah and Nebuah with Yeshua, where the Satan was like complaining and bringing dinim on Yeshua for the fact that he allowed his children to marry Goyim. And I think in the prophecy, the question I think they said like ud mutzal mi-ish, and how like he basically the in the Midwest the judge like Hashem was like defending Yeshua, saying like the exile and the Golos basically caused this to happen, and in some sense he shouldn't be held responsible for it. So I thought that was a very very powerful point. How if I'm reading it correctly, how he almost like Hashem didn't like justify, but exonerated him from this since like due to the Golos. So I would just like to that extent like of marrying like non-Goyim, non-Jew, it sounds just like very very honestly very sharp. But not only that, also just like it gave me also a general picture, also an idea of like how Hashem judges in general, and how Hashem like take into consideration the general situation, generation, and influences that a person is experiencing.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Again, just to be sure everybody is on the same page. The Haftarah of Baloscha is the very same Haftarah as Shabbos Chanukah. So this is we hear this Haftarah twice a year. It's from the Navi Zechariah. Zechariah is one of the very, very last Nevi'im at the time of the building of the second Beis HaMikdash. Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi. Zechariah, Rashi says in Zechariah, we'll get to it in our talk here eventually. Zechariah is a very enigmatic Navi. And Rashi says, Susuma Ma'od, filled with mysterious visions. And one of the visions in a dream is he sees Yehoshua. Yehoshua is Yehoshua, not Yehoshua ben Nun. Yehoshua ben Yehotzadak is the first Kohen Gadol of the second temple. The first Kohen Gadol. And Yehoshua was dressed, it says, in the dream, not in real life, in filthy clothing. Filthy, actually, it's a very strong term. It means excrement-encrusted clothing. So, yeah. And what happened was the Satan is accusing Yehoshua of being unworthy, and Chazal explained the whole Shakla V'Tarya because Yehoshua's own sons had married Goyim. Intermarriage, which was a big problem at the beginning of the Bayis Sheni. And the vision Zechariah has is that Yehoshua was told by Hashem, take off your filthy clothing, put on glorious clothing, and you will be Hashem's Kohen. And then there's a vision of a golden menorah with oil, and the famous verse, not by strength and not by valor, but through the Spirit of Hashem, you will prevail. Great, great, wonderful. And the connection to Hanukkah is the story of the menorah. So the emes is, as just repeating what you said, that the Satan was saying that Yehoshua deserves to be condemned. How could he be Kohen Gadol? What gives him the right to be a spiritual leader? He can't control his own kids. His own kids do the worst of Averos. He doesn't deserve to be Kohen Gadol. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu was basically saying, listen, there was a Golus, there was a Chorban, there was a persecution. Things go out of control sometimes. So the interesting thing is, number one, though, this is not necessarily giving a pass to the kids. Giving a pass to the father, meaning you can't blame the father. Now, this is relevant to us in the following way. And you got to be very, very careful. Life is full of excuses, and we have to be careful not to give ourselves excuses all the time. You know, if we gave ourselves excuses for this and for that and for that and for that, then we would give ourselves a free pass for every Avera. And obviously, we got to be accountable, and we got to overcome our circumstances. But after the fact, when there is failure, HaKadosh Baruch Hu does take into account the totality of circumstances in a way that a human court cannot. I remember hearing from Rav Reisman, Rav Yisrael Reisman, who comes here every summer. He said it's interesting that when Hashem is described as our judge on Rosh Hashanah, we don't call him Shofet. We call him Melech. Hashem is always called. In other words, when we talk about the judicial function of God, we don't use the word Shofet. We use the word Melech. Now, why is that so? So Rav Reisman wanted to suggest that a Shofet has to follow the letter of the law, and a Shofet cannot make differences, meaning if you stole the bread, you got to pay for it, and it makes no difference if you stole it just to make money or you stole it because you have a starving child. Who cares? You broke the law, you're a ganaf, you're a gazlan, you got to pay. A dayan cannot change the halacha out of rachamim. But a melech has a certain koach where a melech is not bound by rules. A melech can look at circumstances, and the circumstances are different. The Eibishter judges us not as a shofet. The Eibishter judges us as a melech, and that's a very important point. So, yeah, intermarriage is a sin, no matter who does it. But intermarriage, because of pressure, because of gullus, because of persecution, is way different than intermarriage because I just didn't care. Now, in the United States, as many of you know, we've reached a matzav that is frankly unbelievable, unbelievable. In many parts of the United States, 7 out of 10 marriages involving a Jew will be to a non-Jew. Intermarriage at 70%, way more than half. Now, how does that work? You know, intermarriage is even in my lifetime, I remember intermarriage was a rare thing. Even among non-Orthodox Jews, it was a rare thing. You heard about, Aunt so-and-so, married a guy, etc. It was a big scandal. So now, let's look at it this way. If a non-religious kid intermarries, how do I view them? Do I look at them as, oh, you're a Rasha, you're a betrayer, you're rejecting the Jewish people? Or is he simply going with the flow like everybody else does? It's still a sin, and it's still awful, and we still got to try to stop it, for sure. But obviously, the way I look at the person is in a totally different way. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky said this, the minhag in Europe was, if, God forbid, a child married outside of Judaism, the parents treated him as dead, and they sat shiva for him. That was the standard practice in Europe. They sat shiva for a child that intermarried. He or she was dead. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky said, Bizman hazeh, now this was already 30 years ago, and I think even more so now. Bizman hazeh, that's improper. Because in Europe, where most of the Jews were religious, if you intermarried, you were defying Jew, you were spitting on Judaism. You were saying, I don't care. Judaism is meaningless to me. So you were a renegade, you were a betrayer, you were a traitor to Am Yisrael. So as a result, a certain extreme distancing took place. Today, the guy is just doing what 7 out of 10 people are doing. He's not rebelling. He's not intending to spit on Judaism. So Rav Yaakov said, Bizman hazeh, the most important thing is to try to keep a connection, even with your intermarried child, because that way you could salvage them. You can have some Jewish connection. Now, he wasn't saying, again, you have to be very careful. He was not saying you can go to the wedding. He was not saying any of that. Can you go to the wedding? Usually not, as a matter of fact. But we're not talking about going to the wedding. We're not talking about any of that. But we're simply talking about what will be your ongoing relationship to your child and to his or her non-Jewish spouse. And Rav Yaakov said you got to have some type of connection to them. You can't just treat them as being dead. And this ties into the notion that HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at circumstances. And the Torah is eternal, but the circumstances of life do change. And therefore you have to look at the Metzias. You can't, it's like somebody, I'll give you another example of how you have to look at circumstances. I get accused, I don't know how this started, I get accused of being a fanatical Zionist who brainwashes people to make Aliyah. I honestly don't even know where that comes from. But I get mail about how long am I going to brainwash vulnerable Bali Tshuva and force them to move there. I have no idea. I really don't even know where that comes from. But somebody sent me a quotation from the Sefer Pella Yoetz. Have you heard of the Sefer? This is actually a very, very chashuv Sefer. The Pella Yoetz is a wonderful, wonderful Musar Sefer. It's a Sephardic Sefer that goes back, I think, to the 1400s. And it's a Musar Sefer. It deals with many, many different topics of Avodas Hashem. So I will not say anything negative about the Sefer. The Sefer is a beautiful, beautiful Sefer. So he sent me a quote from the Pella Yoetz that said, you should not make Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael until your children are grown and married and you're kind of retired and old and just come here to die because the poverty is so bad. It said, so listen, my point is, so you're showing me a sefer from the 1400s that said moving to Eretz Yisrael is going to be too difficult of a life. Okay, fine. But, that's like saying, I can't move to New York because Benjamin Franklin said the stink of horse manure in New York is too powerful when you walk the streets. Well, okay, maybe there are other problems, but that happens not to be a problem today. So what are you bringing me? You're bringing me rayas from the 1400s that life in Israel is dangerous? The answer is circumstances change. So what I'm saying is in intermarriage as well, circumstances change, and you got to take account those circumstances. Yeah.
So then, would that mean also, therefore, like, if after the person's kid, goes off the derech, let's say, now that's in
Yeah, you're correct. It applies to a lot of things. The problem of kids at risk or kids off the derech, it's a big, 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 big problem. Mamish. Such a painful problem. It's one thing, a kid was never religious. Okay, that's also bad, but whatever. But someone who was from and was raised from and then goes off the derech, it's the parents are in so much pain. Often the kid is in a lot of pain also. And the parents, understandably, blame themselves as being failures. Sometimes the parents did things that were wrong, but not always. Sometimes the parents can be the most wonderful parents. But things happen. Number one, there's free will in the world. Everybody has free will. And number two, the environment can be so strong. The influence can be so strong. The negative schooling, negative experiences. So generally speaking, we shouldn't be so focused on who to blame. We should simply ask ourselves, what can we do to make the situation better? Meaning, look prospectively instead of trying to assign, like, who's the bad person here. And Hashem, judges us, in Rachamim. Everything is considered. And that's a comforting point because a human court cannot consider everything. HaKadosh Baruch Hu can. Yeah.
Let's say a man is eating in a restaurant saying Birkat Hamazon.
Say again, Dave.
A man is saying Birkat Hamazon in a restaurant, and the restaurant has the radio on, and there's Kol Isha. Should he interrupt stop the Birkat Hamazon until the song finishes, so that he's not saying brachot while there's Kol Isha in the background?
Yeah.
And should he then return to that restaurant to eat in the future?
Yeah, very good question. So again, let me just bring out the halacha that's implicit in your question. Kol Isha has two different halachos. You have to understand this. Halacha number one is, I am not supposed to listen to a woman singing. And that makes no difference if I'm learning Torah, or I'm relaxing, or I'm taking a walk. I should not listen to women singing. That's one halacha. But there's another halacha that says, I'm not allowed to say words of Torah, or brachos, or davening when I hear a woman singing. Now, let me point out that second halacha, in many ways, is stricter than the first halacha. Because the first halacha, which is the general prohibition of Kol Isha, does not apply to my wife, or my daughter, or my mother, and perhaps to my sister, meaning I'm allowed to listen to my wife sing, my daughter sing, my mother sing, and that includes grandmother, and perhaps even my sister. But, this is a big chumrah, but legabe Torah and brachos and davening, I am not allowed, even if my wife is singing. And that creates a real problem about Zemiros. How can I sing Zemiros with my wife? So Rav Shlomo Zalman paskins that Zemiros are not called divrei Torah, are not called brachos. So yeah, I can say Zemiros, I can sing with my wife. But bentching l'chayra, I couldn't. People sing benching. How can I sing benching with my wife? It's a good question. Okay, I'm not going to answer the question right now. But so your question is, okay, so I'm sitting in a restaurant and the radio goes on, Kol Isha, am I allowed to say Birkat HaMazon while the radio is a Kol Isha? So the answer would be that you would certainly have a problem if this would have been a live singer. With the radio, there's a general machlokas. If voices that are on radio, particularly if they're not live, and maybe even if they are live, because the way this works is you're not actually hearing the woman's voice. It got converted to electrical impulses and then reconverted. And particularly if you don't know what the singer looks like and you don't have any visual in your head. So in such a situation, you can be somech, and you should be somech, that there's no issur of Kol Isha, and therefore you continue to bench. It would be a more serious shaila if you actually knew the singer and you knew what the singer looked like. Even then, I think once you're in the middle of Birkat HaMazon, you finish it. You finish it up. Now, if there would be a live singer, sometimes restaurants have live singers, you'd have a serious question, and you would have to stop benching. Now, here is the rule, though. If you stop in the middle of benching, and then you're going to start again when she stops singing, it depends how long the break was. If the break was as long as it would take you to bench from beginning to end, you got to start from the beginning. If it's less than beginning to end, you just continue right? So that would be the halacha with a live singer. With a radio, I would say just keep on going on. Now, should you go back to the restaurant again? Well, if it's a live singer, you absolutely should not go back to the restaurant again. If it's a radio, it's not like they're doing Kol Isha. I mean, they're simply on a station. So I assume there's other things besides women singing. There's news and other things. So it's really only b'mikra that they're coming with the song, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. Yeah.
I want to go all the way back to the question someone asked about being named after somebody. Because it brought, I just thought of something interesting, was when you were saying if you are exactly named after someone. So Kanai happened to be. You were talking about if you're named after your grandfather Abraham and he didn't keep Shabbos, maybe you think in your head when you're naming your kid, not exactly that you're naming them because they're connected. So then how does that play into like someone's free will? Like if someone is named after and their parents didn't think about that.
Yeah.
When versus me, like I don't know how much are my choices influenced now by my grandfather that I'm named
Yeah.
after.
So for sure. I mean, listen, free will ultimately trumps everything. So nobody is going to be born to be bad or born to be good. But free will operates against the background of challenges. So all we're saying is this is a challenge that is added to your equation. Now, we also believe that when a person has greater challenges, God also gives them greater counter strengths to fight those challenges. But I would just call it, a deficit of sorts. It's hard to measure how much, but it absolutely does not overcome your free will. It just creates a challenge in life. And, we try to keep challenges away from our kids as much as we can. Yeah.
I've heard there are some differences between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Sifrei Torah. Which one of these is the Sefer Torah that was written before Bereshit?
Yeah. It's interesting that one of the I was actually going to mention this earlier, but I'm glad you brought it up. One of the arguments that people make for the divine origin of the Torah is because they point out that we've had thousands and thousands of Torah scrolls over thousands and thousands of years, and they are 99.5% the same. So how could that be unless it has a divine origin? Well, that's great, but the problem is that does mean there's a 0.5 or 0.05 difference. And how do you explain differences? There are differences in Sifrei Torah. They are relatively few, and they don't really change the meaning of any verse. But on the other hand, if we believe that as the Rambam says in the Yud Gimel Ikrei Emunah, that every single letter of the Torah was dictated by God to Moshe, then how do you account for any margin of error? Somebody has it wrong. Somebody has a Torah that's not right. Ashkenazim, Sephardim, whatever it is. So it's interesting. I had heard an explanation many, many years ago, and I really wanted to find out the source, and I couldn't find out the source. But finally, somebody sent me a source. And it's interesting that the person who wrote this just was nifter a few days ago. This was Rav Moshe Wolfson, Zichrono Livracha, the Mashgiach of Torah V'das, a great, great Talmud Chacham, a tremendous Baal Machshava in Kabbalah and in Chassidus. And he quoted from the Kamarna Rav Yitzchak Isaac Kamarna, who says the following. And I actually had heard this many years before, but I didn't see the Makor till relatively recently, that on the last day of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, he wrote, miraculously, 13 Torah scrolls. One is the Master Torah that went into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and the other 12 he gave to every tribe. And this we know from the Chumash. The Chumash itself tells us this. But Rav Yitzchak Isaac Kamarna wants to suggest that each tribe got a Torah scroll that was slightly different. Now, we don't know why, because we don't know the significance, but Reuven's Torah scroll was a tiny bit different than Shimon's, because their spiritual mahus, their spiritual essence, needed to be calibrated in a slightly different. Now, again, I want to point out, these are differences that are so minuscule that we don't even know what the differences would be. But on the level of soul, these were differences. So as a result, the suggestion is made that the differences in Torah scrolls are not based on mistakes in transmission, but on the fact that indeed there were multiple valid Torah scrolls, all of which Hashem had dictated to Moshe, that reflects different tribal Torahs. Now, that still means I can't identify which is Reuven's scroll, which is Shimon's scroll, etc. We don't have the ability to reconstruct it. But the point is, however, all of them are equally legitimate, because after all, unless you're a Levi, you don't know your tribe anyway. Right? You could be from any of the tribes, even the lost 10 tribes. People make a common mistake. People sometimes think, since the 10 tribes were exiled more than 100 years before the Chorban, so the only tribes that were left at the time of the Chorban are Yehuda, Binyamin, and Levi. So by definition, people make the mistake, every Jew that's alive today must either be from Yehuda, Binyamin, or Levi. You can't be from Reuven or Shimon because they were exiled with the 10 tribes. That is incorrect, because even though the kingdom of the 10 tribes was destroyed, there were always remnants of the 10 tribes who had migrated to the south. This is beferish in the book of Ezra, that in the counting of the Jews who were in Eretz Yisrael in the time of Ezra, we included not only Yehuda, Binyamin, and Levi, but remnants of other Shvatim. So the point I'm making is, therefore, you don't know your tribe. I don't know my tribe if I'm a Yisrael. So as a result, any of these Torahs are going to be valid. But the Chiddush of Rav Yitzchak Isaac Kamarna is that they all are from Hashem. They are not mistakes in transmission. Yeah.
Did he have what was the basis for saying
Well, it was a parish on the Zohar. He based it on something in the Zohar. By the way, the Arizal says a very similar thing about the different texts of davening. Ashkenaz, you ask the same question, meaning, what did the Anshe Knesset Hagdola write? What was the correct Shemona Esrei? So the Arizal writes that there were 12 different versions for each Shevet. Just like the Beis HaMikdash had 13 gates. Each Shevet had its own gate, and if you didn't know your gate, you went into gate 13. So the Arizal says there are 12 nuschos of tefillah, but the nusach hari, he said, was the shar hakolel. If you didn't know your shevet, nusach hari will get you there. Of course, the question is, what is nusach hari? I mean, that's the big problem. You know, Chabad calls its siddur nusach hari because Rav Shneur Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, prepared a text based on the Arizal that he said it was nusach hari. But the truth of the matter is, that was the Balatanya Shita. Of course, the Balatanya was an Adam Gadol Ma'od. But the truth of the matter is, there are many other Shitos as to what is Nusach Hari. So, in fact, every Eidot HaMizrach Siddur today is based on some Shita of what is Nusach Hari. Right? So Nusach Hari is not only Chabad's Nusach Hari. There are in fact, the Alter Rebbe says he examined 60 Siddurim to figure out what he considered to be the best Nusach. But that means there's a lot of Nuschos out there in different ways. Yeah?
Two things, but I think they're kind of related. How come Rachel is the primary nook of Zah when Leah is paired with Yisrael and Rachel is paired with Yaakov? So there's higher, and how come, why in Shemona Esrei, between Hakel and Kallah, there's the idea we're building the Achraim of Leah and then Rachel. So how does that work within the bracha, and why are we doing that there in that way? Why the Achraim there, and why is Rachel considered the primary nook when she's considered lower than Leah?
Yeah, but this is a very good point. It's been said, and you see this from the Psukim, that Rachel was the Iker wife of Yaakov, but Leah is the Iker wife of Yisrael after the name was changed, and Rachel died around that time. And of course, Leah built 6 of the Shvatim, and if you add together the Shifcha, Zilpah, you have 8 Shvatim. Rachel has 2 and 2. Rachel has 4, so Leah has double, even if you include the Shvachas. And so it's an interesting question, but part of it is this. Part of it is that Rachel was the wife of Yaakov during his years of struggle, during his years of aliyah, meaning he had reached eventually a pinnacle of ruchnius success, which is encapsulated in the name of Yisrael. And that's a wonderful thing. It's like you think about, I'm thinking of a secular analogy. You know, somebody was with a guy as he built his business with blood, sweat, and tears. And then what sometimes happens in the secular world is he divorces her and marries somebody else when he's wealthy and successful. But there's a special chashivas to the one that was your partner in the years of struggle. Now, of course, Leah was with Yaakov also all of those years, but in terms of the Igeres HaRamban, we look at the foundation of Yaakov as Rachel is a foundation.
And so that applies to the Parsufim, but we don't view Yaakov as higher than Yisrael as a Parsuf, right? But we view Rachel and Leah is on top of Rachel.
Well, it's consistent. Well, one second, because Yisrael is above Yaakov, Leah is above Rachel. But they're above in the sense of a yesod is below a binyan, but the yesod is essential to the binyan. So this is not a matter of inferiority. It's a matter of foundation versus binyan. So einochinami. That's the word Igeres HaRamban actually means the foundation of the house. So in that sense, it is Yaakov, and of course the heel itself, right, is the foundation of the body, right? I'm standing on my heel. Yaakov and Rachel are the yesod of the binyan. The binyan itself is Leah and Yisrael, right? So that's why you have it in that way. So it's not inferiority, it's the idea of the process of aliyah versus being on the madrega. Okay, one more, that's it? Yeah.
Are you allowed to visit Roman baths and even Roman structures, the place that the Romans built?
Are you allowed to visit the Roman buildings?
The Roman buildings and the baths that they used?
Yeah. So it all depends. I mean, not everything was avodah zarah. You're allowed to visit a Roman, the Colosseum, for example. You know, you can go to the Colosseum because that was a stadium. To visit the buildings that were used for idolatry is an interesting question. Let me explain something. There is a principle that avodah zarah that belonged to a non-Jew, if it is mutilated, destroyed, loses its status as avodah zarah. Now, avodah zarah owned by a Jew is stricter. Even if it's smashed, you're not allowed to benefit from it. So a lot of the ruined buildings of the Colosseum, or not the Colosseum, but even the buildings of temples, if they are in a state of disrepair, that is considered to be nullification. So at that point, you'd be allowed to visit them. Now, a building that is still used for avodah zarah is a real problem, and this, of course, is the problem of Vatican City. People ask the question a lot. I visit, Vatican City is technically it's a separate country. Vatican City is a country. The Pope is like the president of Vatican City, in addition to being the head of the Catholic Church. But Vatican City is a country, but it's totally located within Rome. It's a tiny little country. And it's full of churches, as you would expect. And a lot of those churches are very famous museums. The Sistine Chapel is a very good example. That's the Pope's private base Knesset. He goes there and he does Mass every day. But on the ceiling of the chapel, you have the famous paintings of Michelangelo, Creation of the World, beautiful, beautiful paintings. And it's open to the public as a museum, right? You go to, right? So the question that people ask when people go to Rome is, am I allowed to go into the Sistine Chapel and the like? And the short answer is, unfortunately, no. Because the Sistine Chapel is an active church. It's not like a Roman thing that, was used 2,000 years ago that's in ruins. It's an active makom of avodah zarah, so a Yid is not allowed to enter. So basically Vatican City is kind of, you can walk in the street, but there's nothing you can go into in Vatican City. Well, actually, you can go into the library. I don't know if it's open to the public, but the truth is the Vatican Library has many, 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 many old Talmudic manuscripts of Rishonim and Achronim and Gemaras, and people who print like newly discovered manuscripts often get them from the Vatican. So that's a library that you can go into, but you can't go into any of the museums because they are usually mamish churches. The same thing with Notre Dame in Paris, famous cathedral. You really cannot go into those places. Okay? Alrighty, take it. One more, last one.
Well, there's a second half of my question I asked about by the system of the Rashash between Hakel and Kallah. Could you describe what we're building there by making the Achraim and why is it there?
I'm going to have to look at it a little bit because I'm not holding right now in the Rashash's very complicated system. The Rashash's again. Among the Litvasha, when you see Rashash, you think of a Rav Shmuel Strashin of Vilna, who is in the back of the Gemara. But in Chachmei Kabbalah, Rav Shalom Sharabi was one of the greatest of the Mekubalim. Very, very complicated system based on the Kabbalah of the Arizal. So I'll be happy to look at it. But right now, I need to think about it a little bit. Okay, be well. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this Samayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.